to our Friday webinar series. As you're well aware now, this webinar series is in its third year. And in this webinar series, we have made an attempt to bring the best minds across the world, domestic and foreigner, maintaining a blend of domestic researchers and global researchers on contemporary issues. COVID is past now. Once again, we are thinking of long-term growth. At one point, the Prime Minister had given us a $5 trillion vision. Now the Prime Minister has taken us further and is talking about India at 100. And some of us have been involved and engaged in looking at how India would look in 2047. We did some work, very fortunate for Niti. But then I came across, I would say, stumbled upon this excellent work by E&Y and done by our dear friend and colleague, very respected, Dr. Srivastava, who was chairing and heading Madras School of Economics for a long time. So we invited him at a very short notice. Very short notice. This report has been presented at the World Economic Forum very recently, and we invited him at such a short notice and we requested him to please come. We are fortunate that he accepted it, and here we are thinking about India, another perspective, India at 100. I'm really happy to share with you, economists in our country have now started thinking. The Indian Economic Association in their annual function at Bangalore thought about it. Very recently, there was another seminar which I attended, and therein also the professor had thought through and said, what would India be at 100? And that's why I say the economists have started thinking about India at 100. Today, we have invited Dr. Srivastava to present the Ernst Young's report. To chair the session today, we have Professor Dholakia to guide us through the discussion. As we all know, Professor Dholakia has spent long years at IIM Ahmedabad, and he has received the most distinguished faculty award for the year 1718 at IMA. He has about 41 years of experience teaching economics to different groups like students, executive, policymakers, and senior government officers. He has been a regular visiting faculty to teach at the European Management Institute, Paris, from 2002 to 2005. He has collaborated on a series of research projects with the Earth Institute of Columbia University from 2004-5 to 2012-13. He has also extensively worked on monetary policy in our country. He was a member of the Monetary Policy Committee from 2016 to 2021. He was a member of the 6th Central Pay Commission from 2006, Pay Commission during 2006-8. He was also a member of the High-Level Committee on Leveraging Postal Network in India, and he has also been involved in the merger of Air India and Indian Airlines. He has worked extensively in government committees, both at the center and in the state. Amongst the important assignments that he has done, I think he's still chairing a committee on subnational accounts appointed by the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, Government of India. And I was in UP and they were talking about how to build subnational accounts. So that idea is now reaching the masses. The speaker for the day from Ernst Young presenting the report is Dr. D.K. Srivastava. As I mentioned, he is now the Chief Policy Advisor EY. He is a noted economist, well-known academician, and he brings in vast experience in areas of public finance and fiscal policy. He has also contributed extensively in policy making and associated with the 10th Finance Commission, 11th Finance Commission, 12th Finance Commission, 15th Finance Commission. So he has been very practical oriented himself and policy oriented. He was chairman committee on fiscal statistics set up by the National Statistical Commission in 2017. And I can tell you that's extensive work. In 2002, I was the repository of data on monetary statistics, and I know amount of hard work and labor that requires and meticulousness with which you have to deal with that statistics. He was chairman working group on fiscal management beyond FRBM constituted by the RBI. He's worked long years, as I mentioned, at the Madras School. With this, I hand over the session to Professor Dholakia to carry forward the session, please.
Thank you, Dr. Charan Singh. It's always a pleasure to be a part of this seminar series by EGROW Foundation. It is particularly a very gratifying kind of thing that Professor D.K. Srivastava, whom I hold very highly in in terms of his understanding, conceptual clarity, and all that. So it is a very important thing to listen to him on what he thinks India would be at 100 years of independence and beyond, of course. So I don't want to be between him and the audience anymore. I just hand over the mic to him, and I request him that his presentation could be whatever, 50, 60 minutes, whatever he wants. I think we would like to listen to him. So over to Professor D.K. Srivastava.
Thank you very much, Professor Dholakia, Professor Charan Singh. It's a privilege for me to participate in your esteemed webinar series. I am thankful for that opportunity. As you know, this is a work that has drawn upon contributions by a large team, drawn from EY and from inputs also taken from outside. And I have a number of collaborators. Some of those participants are present here, but there were a number of senior partners at EY who gave us sectoral perspectives. Of course, the core of the presentation will deal with our forecasting framework and how we went about, in fact, how did we get initiated into this? How did we get interested into this? So, and let me also say that this is part of an ongoing exercise because this is something that is a theme that is going to run from now on for several years into the future, and every time a base year changes, various global conditions change, then the simulations will have to change. So this is an exercise in which we will have to evolve as the global economy evolves. And I would very much welcome your interventions and inputs as we go along. So let me start by indicating to you the two critical references that interested us while we were thinking about the subject of India at 47. One was an OECD study, and OECD comes periodically with their forecasts for a set of selected countries. Their forecast is cast in terms of purchasing power parity comparisons. So whenever we have a reasonable number of countries where across country comparisons are attempted, often the denominator that is considered relevant is the purchasing power parity comparison. This is what we refer to as PPP. And then there is this London-based institute, Center for Economic Policy Research, and they have recently come out with their forecasts. They also come with periodic forecasts. I have not seen similar works emanating from India or from many other emerging market economies. And so I was looking at their forecasts and looking at their methodology and so on. Their forecasting models are, of course, proprietary items, but we have a number of supporting technical papers wherein we can draw some of the basic assumptions and some of the steps that they use. And those forecasts that they indicated, we have summarized here in terms of decadal averages, just for comparison. And the point that comes out very clearly is that across the countries, major countries, and for the world as a whole, you would find that as we evolve into successive decades, the growth rates keep falling for the world in both cases, for the US, for China, and for India also. In all cases, the growth rate that we are experiencing now in the decade of 20s would keep falling as we go along. This is so for everybody, and this is so because their models are driven, quite appropriately, of course, by very large role of capital. And as the base of capital enhances, the capital stock, magnitude of capital stock increases, the rate of depreciation or the capital consumption rate keeps increasing because technology makes a lot of existing capital obsolete. And of course, the contribution even from out of labor and from out of technical progress also dwindles. Labor in many of the developed countries is actually growing, as we shall see, at lower and lower rates. And technological progress also reaches a certain saturation level, and after that incremental contribution of technological progress also comes down. So for all of these reasons, we find that the growth rates in all of these cases keep falling. But you would notice that it falls rather sharply for India, also for China, not that sharp a fall in the case of US, where it has remained at about say 1.7% all along. The fall is only from 1.7 to 1.2. Whereas in our case, you would find from 6.9, it is falling and going all the way to 2.1 in the case of CEPR, and similarly in the case of OECD. So we were wondering whether we can play with some of the parameters that they have used in order to see some alternative simulation results, but we found it very difficult to enter in their modeling frameworks because all of the assumptions are not very clearly spelled out, and some of the assumptions actually do not apply to us, like the rate of return on capital and so on. So they have used common assumptions across a large number of countries, and possibly that seems unrealistic. And therefore we decided that at least for India, we will endeavor to undertake our own exercise, a long-term supply side approach to developing a forecasting framework. With that in perspective, we started developing this framework, but now that we were doing it by ourselves, we looked at the kind of questions that are being raised by the policymakers and in terms of the cross-country comparisons. And we find that as far as Indian policymakers are concerned, they are looking at the size of the economy in terms of either market exchange rate or purchasing power parity, and looking at the years where the Indian economy would cross critical thresholds, like $5 trillion and $10 trillion and $30 trillion and so on. So what is the time when we would reach that level? The other question that sometimes policymakers are interested in, whether we are going to become a developed country, by what mark, but what time our per capita GDP would increase enough for us to be classified as a developed country. So if you look at a single country, these were the critical questions that policymakers were raising. If you look at cross-country comparisons, the questions that are being considered are, when are we going to overtake some of the peer countries? Like, are we going to take the US economy in terms of size of the economy, or China, or both of them? And similarly, another question in which we can be interested is, how would the share of India's GDP evolve in world output? Is it a case that sooner or later we will reach our earlier prosperous days? You know, Madison has prepared a very long historical perspective on the kind of prosperity that India had experienced. And some 300 years ago, we were having a share of about 25% of our GDP. It has come down to just less than 4.5%. So we have lost our preeminent position. So now that we were opening that question ourselves, we thought that let us develop a framework in which we can answer all of these questions. And even sometimes comparison is made in PVP, and sometimes comparison is made in market exchange rate. So we said we will answer all of these alternative questions in our framework. And with that objective in our mind, we started to look at the perspectives in terms of basic information, which we drew first of all from the forecasts that are available for the medium term, in terms of the forecast that the International Monetary Fund does. And in this table, we bring out that very clearly they have identified India as the global growth leader in the current decade. So that is, and in relative to the world, we are able to show something like a 100% more growth rate. So this is just evolving into a century for India, and the medium term is quite promising. And from then on, we moved into the longer term perspective, which we drew from OECD, to which we shall come in a moment. But as we start to address this question, we recognized that this decade, and indeed the next few decades, are going to be characterized by massive global uncertainty. And some of these uncertainties we have here listed in terms of a recent analysis, a recent book that was published by Nouriel Roubini, and he has identified 10 unprecedented mega threats to the global economy, like excessive global debt. Many of the developed countries are very excessively indebted, such as Japan, even US now, some of the European countries, even China, when you consider public and private debt together. When debt is very large, then the efficacy of fiscal policy to cope with cyclical challenges to the global economy becomes much less. This is why we notice that he also points out that there is a growing ineffectiveness of public policy tools. Monetary policy, there has been a tremendous monetary expansion across the globe. Many European countries have expanded their money supplies very, very substantially. And many governments have become very heavily indebted. And therefore, the flexibility that is there to cope with cyclical challenges, either using fiscal policy or monetary policy or a combination, has become much less today than it used to be the case earlier. The third mega challenge is that across the globe, there is an accelerated aging of populations. Most of the populations across the world, the share of population above the age of 60 to 65 years is increasing in terms of share, and that means much lower labor supply in the working age group. So also experiences about high inflation episodes and economic cycle disturbances have also multiplied in terms of frequency, and their occurrence has become more frequent than earlier. More in the near future, there is a clear slide into global stagflation. Similarly, there is financial instability. Right now, we are also seeing a reversal of the thrust towards globalization. And Rubini calls it as progressive deglobalization. Countries are left to their own tricks. And the earlier 2008 crisis, for example, many of the G20 countries came together and mounted a coordinated intervention. But more and more countries are now being left on their own. And there are also arising challenges arising from the growth of robots and artificial intelligence and so on, which would lead to a lot of substitution of human resources vis-a-vis technical inputs. And new geopolitical challenges are also arising, and the first big one that we are now seeing is in terms of the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which has disturbed all kinds of supply chains in the global economy. And then there is a greater frequency of climate-related environmental catastrophes. So whatever development or growth strategy India should work out, will have to really take into account not just factors that will accelerate growth, but also strategies that would enable us to meet anticipated and unanticipated challenges which will cause shocks to our growth profile. So we thought in terms of developing a framework of both policy and strategic intervention such that we can maximize or optimize available growth enablers and develop a strategy that would minimize the impact of these mega threats to the Indian economy, and we are not going to be immune with respect to this. Now, the reason why India is different from everybody else in this century is the fact recognized by almost all economists, is that we are going through a window of a demographic profile which occurs for a country once in several centuries. This is our century, without any doubt. This is the benefit that has accrued to India almost spontaneously by the juxtaposition of the death rates and birth rates in their long-term evolution paths, such that what we find is that, and this chart is actually just a summary of that demographic dividend window that India is experiencing. Now, in this year, the current year, 2023, India is slated to become the largest population size economy, overtaking that of China in terms of the overall size. We might have already overtaken them. At least by the close of the year, we will do so. But many people argue that perhaps their population size is overstated. Then we also notice that the share of working age population to total population peaks in this at the end of this decade at 68.9% by 2030, overtaking China in terms of the number of persons in the working age group. China has experienced a similar peak, but that is now about 2 decades earlier. That has happened. They took advantage of that. Now our turn has come. We also notice that India's overall dependency ratio becomes lowest in its history by 2030 at 31.2%. Now, dependency ratio and working age population contribute to both channels of growth. If we have more workers, then we have a larger labor supply. But if we have a lower dependency ratio, then we have a higher savings ratio. A higher savings ratio translates into higher investment and capital formation. So both from the side of capital and from the side of labor, this is going to be our century, provided of course we take advantage of that. And as this century evolves, we also notice that excess of India's working age population share over that of China would be at its maximum by 2056. This is all in the period of forecast that we are considering. And you find that shaded area towards the right side of the chart gives us the excess of India's working age people over that of China. That's throughout the century we will have a much larger contribution of workers in the working age group to the global labor supply. Not just for India, but to the global labor supply, because we have to juxtapose this with the aging populations of the rest of the world. So you find that their labor supply is shrinking and our labor supply is peaking. And this is a match in which we will not only export our human resources and contribute to global growth and contribute it through direct and indirect interventions. So export of services also become very important apart from export of goods. That is the benefit that is becoming, that is accruing to India almost simultaneously. And there is, and it is very clear that we can't let this opportunity go. We can't let it pass by. It can become, as a blessing, it can also become a curse if we are not going to be utilized, going to be making use of this population by skilling them, educating them, imparting them a high level of education and a robust health. Unless we have public policy support that would augment education and health facilities in the economy, we might even pass this by. It's a large blessing, but we have to be ready for this. So now we come to, with this background, I will only spend some time giving you some inkling of the kind of projection methodology that we have utilized. So for cross-country perspectives, we made, as I mentioned earlier, reference to IMF for medium-term forecast, OECD for the long-term forecast, CEPR only for reference. OECD is the one that gives us in purchasing power parity terms. They use a long-term model, a production function in which they are able to decompose the impact of capital, fixed capital, stock growth, labor supply, and pace of technological progress. So growth is decomposed into these three terms. Our methodology is similar to them, but we have used only India-specific assumptions. The key determinant of growth in our case is the way saving is generated in the economy, linked through the demographic dividend that we talked about, is converted into investment, and then it leads to capital formation, which leads to increase in capital stock. And that contributes to the capital supply. On the labor side, we have the population growth plotted out, which is converted into a labor force participation rate, making a distinction between male and female participation rates. And we set up certain norms and set up rates of adjustment as we evolve over the years. We undertook 3 simulations, S1, S2, and S3, in order to change some of the assumptions that we have used, not all of them. So some of the parameters fixed are fixed across simulations and some of those are changed. The main change is to incorporate the effect of augmentation of the saving rate and the incorporation of technological progress in our production function. So these are parameterized to a degree and their impact is differentially estimated across the simulations. One particular point that I would make is that we have taken advantage of the fact that capital goods prices have tended to be lower than the prices of consumption goods or the prices or the overall GDP deflator. And this enables us to convert the nominal saving rate into, when we come to converting into the real investment rate, we have taken advantage of the fact that capital goods have tended to be in recent years somewhat cheaper than our overall GDP deflator. And that gives us an advantage, a factor that can add to real capital supply. I will explain these steps because in our story, capital stock is the main actor, the hero. I will explain that in some greater detail as we go along. The other factor that many of these multilateral agencies have incorporated is the fact that as capital stock increases in size, the rate of consumption of fixed capital increases. That is one of the main reasons why our growth rates go down as we go along. So that is the broad methodology. Let me spend one more moment on how we treat our saving and investment rate, because that is the art of the matter. So we start with the nominal saving rate. That nominal saving rate has been, as you know, has been falling in recent years. And last 3-4 years, the average has been about 30.5%. From that to that nominal saving rate, we also add in nominal terms the net inflow of foreign capital, in both cases relative to GDP, nominal GDP. And by adding this, we get the nominal investable resources in the system. At this point, we convert it into a real investment rate. The nominal investment rate is converted into the real investment rate by adding the impact of this differential between capital goods deflator vis-a-vis GDP deflators. One in the numerator, the other in the denominator. After that, we deduct change in stocks, valuables, and discrepancies. And we also adjust for the consumption of fixed capital. So this enables us to move from gross to net fixed capital formation. And from there, we feed this into the production function, add the impact of labor and technological progress, and generate our GDP growth rate. So this movement is the one that we change in our simulations. So not by very significant margins, but from 30.5 we allow in our simulation S1 and S2 the saving rate gradually to increase to 32.5%, just an increase of 2 percentage points. But of course, this is profiled over the forecast period, and the maximum increase happens in this decade when the demographic dividend peaks. So that is as far as saving is concerned. This characterizes both S2 and S3. And in S1, we have let it remain fixed at 30.5. Then in S3, we combine this increase in the saving rate by adding the adding to the contribution of technological progress, a parameter. And there also the increases are not by very wide margins. Only small increases are incorporated. And that enables us to generate three results, which we have referred to as S1, S2, and S3. Now, before we come to those results, and after we have arrived there, then it's very straightforward to move into our findings. Let me just spend a little time on two sets which are important. One is, what are the growth enablers that we have considered in the overall forecasting framework? So as we mentioned, the domestic saving and investment rate is critical, and this is to be linked to the unfolding demographic dividend and supported by maintaining a sustainable fiscal deficit along with the paths that have been indicated by either the existing FRBM or a modified FRBM on which we have some views ourselves. And along with that, we supplement that by a progressive increase in India's tax GDP ratio. And this will enable the required augmentation of expenditure in education and health that we have talked about. Then we have said that India will, along this growth path, and also undergo a structural change in GDP. And we predict that the share of services would increase, the share of agriculture would fall, and the share of manufacturing or industry, in fact, broadly, would almost remain stable. And these ratios towards the terminal years would be something like agriculture with a share of 5%, industry with a share of 20%, and the balance being made up by the services sector. This is characteristic of also modern day developed economies. Then the third enabler, and this helps us both in terms of our climate related goals, but also in terms of utilizing our limited or constrained savings, in the sense that the service sector is less capital intensive as compared to the industrial sector. Then the male and female participation in labor force, we train them, educate them, keep them in good health, and also ensure increase in their labor force participation, and then eventually actual employment rates. Then, as already the existing policy is there, accelerating infrastructure investment by participation of public and private investors. Increasing complexity of goods and services. So one thing that we have noticed is that exports, to remain competitive in exports, the complexity of goods and services become higher and higher across countries. So the leaders in terms of complex goods, many studies have actually generated indexes of complexity of goods and so on. In terms of possibility, India ranks 1, but in terms of actual achievement, India is much lower at around 20, 21 in terms of ranking. So we have said that as we induct new and new technology and digitization of transactions increases, goods will become more and more complex, both goods and services. And as that happens, we will be able to have a better competitiveness of exports as we go along. This would require a lot of inputs in terms of IT and new technologies. Then the share of government expenditure in education, training, skilling and health, as we talked about, has to increase from its presently stagnant levels. Then continuing Make in India, especially in strategic manufacturing, and reducing dependence on imported intermediate products is part of our growth enabler strategy. Focus on environmental friendly growth, low energy intensive, and this will be facilitated by increased share of services and increased share of exports in our GDP. On the whole, it is important to recognize that we have to set up a virtuous cycle of increased employment, higher per capita incomes, higher domestic savings, higher investment rate by supplementing domestic savings with sustainable current account deficit and taking advantage of improvements in technology and increase in multi-factor productivity. So these are the growth enablers that inform our analysis. This is one part. The second part is, and I would like to emphasize this even more than growth enablers, because in many analysis this is missed out. And that is how to minimize the adverse impact of cyclical and one-time shocks to the economy. As you know, the whole episode with the COVID actually made us lose 4 to 5 years in terms of reaching the 5 trillion target. We have recently experienced a number of shocks, one-time shocks, like the 2008 crisis, like this 2021 crisis, 2021 crisis, and so on. But in all cases, we adjusted only as reactions. We were not really prepared for meeting such shocks. But we have argued that there is a possibility of really in reducing our vulnerability to global shocks and reducing the adverse impact on growth of these shocks. So we distinguish between economic cycles and one-time shocks. Economic cycles such as agriculture and non-agricultural cycles are well known to us. We also have frameworks in which we try to minimize the adverse impact, such as the FRBM reforms, the flexibility that has been allowed in the 2018 amendment of the FRBM in terms of fiscal deficit. But we think that these are not adequate just as yet. In fact, we have missed out on the FRBM targets year after year. And whatever fiscal deficit flexibility was allowed proved to be quite inadequate, either for the 2008 crisis or for the 2021 crisis. And we have to have a more flexible framework and a revised set of limits, which of course I will not develop here, but we have certain views on the subject. But one thing I will highlight is that in our fiscal federal framework, we have to allow for states to really play a greater role in meeting with agricultural and non-agricultural cycles. Agricultural cycle is a straightforward choice in the sense that the subject is also under the supervision of the state governments. But even for non-agricultural cycles, it would be very useful if the central government can coordinate, as it is presently doing, by co-opting state governments, and some of our state governments are larger than many full-fledged countries. So we also suggest that it would be useful to consider setting up an agricultural stabilization fund over and above the fiscal deficit flexibility in order to minimize agricultural cyclical influences. And the fiscal deficit flexibility needs to be increased under certain parametric assumptions. Now the Indian economy is very highly subject to global crude price shocks. And as that goes up and down, the Indian economy also suffers the corresponding shocks. So we have suggested that we have to find strategies by which we can minimize the global crude price shocks. Some of those, you remember that we used to have oil price stabilization funds, but we gave up those funds because we were not able to exercise the necessary fiscal discipline. We drew from those funds but never replenished those. We drew from those funds in bad times but never replenished them in good times. And that kind of strategy failed, and therefore they had to be given up. But I think we require a new thinking in terms of setting up oil price stabilization fund. And there used to be several funds, but now I think one large fund may be enough. Development of strategic reserves, exploration abroad for crude sources, shift to non-oil energy sources like ethanol, hydrogen, and so on. Many of these initiatives that the government of India is actually working on. But this is something very critical if we want to really have a meaningful medium to long-term growth, where the shocks are minimized. Otherwise, we'll keep missing our targets as we go along. Then for wars, epidemics, and pandemics, these are examples of one-time shocks, unanticipated one-time shocks. We have no readiness for any future war. But we are suggesting here that we have to develop dual-use infrastructure, where when something like the pandemic occurs, then we have a ready-made infrastructure where we can shift, where we can set up hospitals, new hospital beds, and so on. And the future shocks of this nature would be very different from the ones that we have historically experienced. Then on climate change and natural disasters, we have a certain framework. We are better than many other countries, but we have not really, and this is something on which the finance commissions had made a contribution. And we had recommended setting up 2 sets of funds, and this institution and framework about this disaster relief work that is getting done, not only in India but also across the globe. Many of those initiatives came from the Finance Commission. We had recommended that we will set up disaster relief funds for the country, across the states, and even at the level of districts. Those relief funds have been set up, but we had also recommended that similarly there should be disaster mitigation funds in anticipation of natural disasters, and those have not yet been set up, although these are part of the act. On economic side, apart from the natural agriculture, non-agricultural cycles, there is this price instability issue, which is also there, and the external sector vulnerability, which is also there. So many other committees have also recommended setting up a fiscal council which can better coordinate between Government of India and the Reserve Bank. And we actually need some kind of coordination between the RBI and the Ministry of Finance, so that both growth and inflation targets can be simultaneously attended to, and our responses can be optimized. Otherwise, they appear to often act in segments and slots. Similarly, we happen to be externally extremely vulnerable, and often this is reflected in the market exchange rate flexibility. And there also we have to define in some way very clearly our sustainable current account deficit to GDP ratio and the way we are managing our foreign exchange reserves, where possibly our portfolio has to be diversified more, and we have to ensure higher returns on our reserves, so that this becomes a better managed set of foreign exchange reserves. So those are the stabilizers that we have recommended, but this is still ongoing thinking, and we think that more needs to be thought through in order to really take advantage of the emerging century for India. Now I come, and this is the last part, and I will soon wind up. This is the last part where we just share with you the findings. So the methodology that we have adopted takes us to a prediction of real growth rates, real GDP growth rates in INR terms. From there, we go to nominal growth rates. From there, we use depreciation rates either for market exchange rates or for purchasing power parity terms in order to convert that into growth rates either in market exchange rate terms or purchasing power parity terms. So the growth profile has 4 profiles, 4 alternative sets: real, nominal, market exchange, and purchasing power parity. This allows us the flexibility for making whatever comparisons we want to make. We have shown here the profiles of trend growth rates. Notice that we are using the term trend growth rate, that is to say we have used a certain filter in order to actually take out the year-to-year volatility, although our forecast is year-to-year. But here we are taking only trend growth rate or potential growth rate. S3 is our highest growth rate in real terms. And in real terms, the peak is 6.2. So there is nothing very ambitious in what we are attempting. In this decade, we will definitely have a higher real GDP growth rate. And then it falls, but it does not fall all the way as predicted by the global agencies, multilateral agencies. In our case also it falls. But as the decades go by, the rate of we remain in the range of 5.5 to 6. That is where the challenge lies. If we utilize our enablers in a proper way and minimize the volatility, that is why the trend growth rate, then we will achieve S3, otherwise not. Doing that, then next set of analysis is really addressing the question of thresholds that we talked about, in which many policymakers are interested. So we cross the 5 trillion benchmark in market exchange rate terms by 2028. Remember that the government used to predict that that will happen by 2025. This 3-year delay is because of this COVID shock. Each shock will delay us by several years. So whatever we are predicting, if we do not allow for minimizing the adverse impact of the shocks, we will keep missing the deadlines. By 2036, we will cross the 10 trillion US dollar threshold. By 2051, of course, we take our forecast up to 61. But 2051, we will have $30 trillion. And if you look at the Amrit Kal, then 47, we will have 26 and 46 in terms of market exchange rate and PPP terms. So those would be the thresholds under the assumptions that we have used in order to look at the kind of possibilities that are there. Now, the other question sometimes which is asked, and this question is only addressed in purchasing power parity terms, because we have not done forecasts for other countries. So we have used the OECD forecasts for China, Germany, Japan, and the US, and only modified our India forecasts to see when we will overtake some of these countries. So in other words, the assumption is that we are using the OECD forecast for these other 4 major countries, and then using our forecast, because we think that their assumptions regarding India are not recognizing the kind of possibilities that are opening up for the Indian economy. If that is the framework, then we see that India is projected to overtake the US economy in terms of the PPP size by FY40, and it will overtake even China by 2051. In the OECD forecast, as well as the CEPR forecast, in both cases they show that we will overtake US, although somewhat later. But it is not the case that they are not forecasting the same, except that we have brought the crossover timelines a little forward by saying that if we develop a suitable strategy, we can do so. And in this, in the next slide, we look at the per capita term possibilities, because this is sometimes also being cited by policymakers as to whether by the end of the Amrit Kal we will become a developed country. So we see that if in terms of market exchange rates, by FY48, we will reach a per capita level of US $15,602, which will cross the threshold of 13,000 currently given by the World Bank as being considered synonymous with reaching a developed country status. So we shall eminently reach there. Now the last finding which I will share with you is in terms of India's current share in the world GDP is 6.9% in FY 2022. But this will keep progressively increasing, and India's share in world population is also increasing. India's share in global PPP GDP is also increasing, and therefore eventually, as I show, and this is the slide that is my favorite, my personal favorite as it were, is to make a reference to this well-known study by Madison, where he shows the history of world and major economies since 1 AD, year 1 AD. And India's share by 1700 was about 24.5% in world GDP. Nearly 1/4 of the world GDP came from India. But we slipped last 3 centuries of growth, 3 centuries of output. And we arrived at this threshold of 3.4% by 3.2% by 1980. So from 25% we have fallen progressively, lost these centuries and decades. So much share has been lost. But as we go along across our forecast, we find that by 2053 we shall regain a share of 1/4 of the world economy. That is to say, from 1700 we have lost 3 centuries and a half century, 3.5 centuries, and we will regain our preeminent position by 2053. So, given all the assumptions, given all the limitations, given all the constraints, I am saying the bright future is bright for the Indian economy. Only if we strategize and take advantage of the growth enablers and the growth stabilizers as the demographic dividend unfolds. So let me stop here. I have taken far more than the time permitted, but then the chairman had given me that flexibility a little bit. And let me now take your comments and questions.
Thank you, Dr. Srivastava. It was an excellent presentation, as expected, and you have emphasized the methodology of forecasting, the assumptions, and the finalities about our achieving the thresholds at the relevant dates, both in terms of the purchasing power parity and the foreign market exchange rates. I presume that the last slide, which is your favorite slide, shows,
yes.
In fact, it is also my favorite slide, incidentally,
Yes.
because I have also been talking about these matters. And
Okay.
Our conclusions are not very different at all. I am very happy to note this. In fact, coming from your side, it only enhances my confidence. That is what anyway, what I am saying is that the last slide is in terms of purchasing power parity, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Because if you take the market exchange rate shares, and if you just look at the things, then probably US was not only 27.5% around 1950, but it was around 50%, roughly 50% of the total world GDP. Anyway, this is a minor point, because what you are saying and what you are suggesting is that even in terms of the growth and the GDP, whether it is in PPP or whether it is in terms of the market exchange rate, we are going to cross the countries in due course. I think it is only a question of waiting.
Right.
It may be a few years here and there. Instead of 2053. It
Right,
might
right.
2060 or 2063 or something of that sort. But that's
Yes.
all. We are going to be at the top anyway. That is how, I had concluded earlier
Okay,
in
okay,
one
okay.
public forum that this century belongs to us.
Yes.
It is not just the decade. Anyway, it is very nice having this entire idea and the kind of the assumptions, etc., that you have made, clarified rather. I understand that it is OECD methodology, and you have basically stuck to the framework of the OECD. I may have some comments on that, but first, as a chair, I would give priority to any question from the floor,
Yes.
including Charan Singh himself.
Yes.
He may be having a lot of questions.
Thank you.
But anyway,
Thank
you
you.
please coordinate the questions. Yeah, please.
Thank you. I would request everybody who has a question to raise their hand, and please ensure the questions are focused, sharp, and directed straight to the topic. No observations, no comments, just on the question. So, Professor Dr. Srivastava, I had one question on the growth rates that you had. You know
Yes.
that China scored 10% growth rate 30 years at a stretch,
Yes.
and similarly Korea and Taiwan. Now, why are you assuming that the growth rate will taper down and we'll not be able to sustain? Because I think we have the potential to sustain 8 to 10% growth. Now, your calculations show that is not the case. So my question is, why are you assuming, why did these countries achieve it, and why are you assuming that we in our country will not be able to achieve it? That is the only question I have for you. But what
Okay.
I'm going to do is to give you, and you have the choice to answer or not answer. I'm going to request.
I will answer this straight away, so that we can
Okay.
deal
Do you
with
want
this.
to collect more questions and then answer, or you want to go one after the other?
Okay, I will take one more and then say a
So
pair
I
of
will
questions
request.
and then yes.
Yeah, I'm going to request once again everybody focused question. So I'll now give a chance to Professor Ashok Vishandas, who's the founder director of EGROW. And after you have answered both our questions, I will then give a chance to Professor Rekha. She's member of the Karnataka State Planning Board. And if someone else raises their hand. So we'll go in lots of 2 and 2. And if we are focused and pointed questions, we'll have many more to join. So
Right.
Ashok Vishandas.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Charan. Thank you, Professor Srivastava. Thank you, Professor Ravinder Dholakia, and all my friends. My questions are two very small questions. At one stage of your presentation, you talked about the economic cycle, and then you say center will play a core role and the state will play supporting role. Now, given the present condition and the recent past, the state, there has been a cooperative federalism, moving from cooperative federalism to competitive
Yes, yes.
national federalism. So in
Right,
this
right.
kind of situation, how state will accept the role of supplementary role when it comes to the economic cycle? That is question one.
Right.
And second, another brief question. In agriculture, it contributes about 18% to GVA with 44% of the labor force. And this also implies that about their labor productivity is about 30%. So where we see, say by 2047, what will be the share of agriculture in the overall GVA or GDP by 2047?
Okay.
Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So on the first question by Professor Charan
Good
Singh.
evening, Professor Srivastava.
Dr. Rekha,
Yes, indeed.
I would request you to mute yourself. Right now, Professor D.K. Srivastava is answering the first two questions. Yes.
So we are just going by a couple of questions so that I do not forget them
Yeah, please.
as we go
Good
along.
evening, Professor Srivastava. It was really amazing to.
Yeah, please carry on, Dr. Srivastava.
Yes, okay. So we studied the peak growth rates achieved by different countries, today's modern developed countries, in their good periods when they achieve peak growth rates. And we found that actually Japan, US, and China, as you cited, in terms of growth rates for their peaks, they had achieved average growth rates of 7 to 9% for a brief period of time, not maintained over a long period of time. In China's case, you have cited that they have shown a growth rate close to 10% or in excess of that for a period of 3 decades. China was able to show, if we are going to believe their figures, a saving rate of more than 50% and an investment rate of more than 45% for many of these years, many years of these decades. We are not going to be able to show that kind of growth rate, that kind of saving rate. Our saving rate recently has been falling. Nominal saving rate with which we have started. We reached a peak of 37% or so earlier, around 2011-12 or so, and since then it has fallen. It has come down to 30%, and I am only envisaging that we will be able to increase it by a slender margin in the next few years. Because the share of consumption is rising faster, very difficult to goad the saving rate up. And unless we goad it up, we will not be able to reach much higher figures and sustain them. Of course, year-to-year variations are there, but on trend basis, this will not be pushed up. So, two observations on that question is, one is that more and more recently, the growth figures, the size of population, the size of GDP in China is being questioned. Not only from abroad, but also from within China. And many people are saying that there has been an overestimation of GDP by a margin of 2% year after year for several decades, in which case because that has a cumulative effect, the magnitude of their economy may be much more overstated than what is coming out of official figures. Even with those official figures, their debt GDP ratio is massively high, if you look at the private sector of the economy. But to reverse the argument, I will argue like this, that we reach these thresholds even by maintaining a growth rate of 5 to 6%. Only maintaining this much, we are able to reach these thresholds which are so desirable and restore our preeminence in the world economy only by making sure that we grow at these rates. So the question is really, we may not have that kind of window open, that kind of export potential open as was available for China, as was available for the US, Japan, and so on. Those windows may not be open anymore. Those saving rates may not be available anymore. But even then, we will reach our destination. Only condition is we reach this much and we remain stable at this much, is the question. Now, the question that was raised about the macro, about the role of state governments in
Good evening, Professor Srivastava. It was really amazing to
Please,
see your projections, which are very
Professor Rekha, let him complete
comparable to
the
Hindu
answer.
growth rate, which
Professor
will
Rekha,
reach.
Professor Rekha, please, Dr. Srivastava, please.
Yeah, so as far as literature on fiscal federalism is concerned, it says that macro stabilization is primarily a responsibility of the central government. By state governments following their own stabilizing policies, often they would push trade into each other. If one state suddenly has a growth stimulating policy, a lot of investment would be drawn from neighboring states into that state and so on. So generally, stabilization is attempted by the central government, but we have to recognize the Indian characteristics. One is that agricultural cycles are not synchronous across states. Agriculture goes through its peaks and troughs differently across states, and therefore states will have to be given that responsibility. Second is that some states are so large, they are like large countries. And therefore, they have to be co-opted, just as it is right now doing. In the present budget, it said we are extending the facility of 3.5%, an extended fiscal deficit for the state governments to invest. So that's a macro stabilization initiative that the central government is bringing state governments on board. So I think that in India's context, it would be useful to minimize the adverse impact of cyclical changes by distinguishing between agricultural and non-agricultural cycles. Those cycles have different amplitudes also. Agriculture 3 to 4 years, non-agricultural 5 to 6 years, and so on. And allow the state governments also to play a role in this. So co-opt them. That would be best for this purpose. You asked a second question. Yeah, what was the second question, please?
Yeah, second question was that contribution of agriculture in the GVA is about 18%, with about 44% of labor force.
Right.
And that also implies the labor productivity is about 30% compared to the non-agriculture sector.
Right.
How do you see the agriculture's share in the GDP by 2047?
Well, I see the share of agriculture falling to about 5%. You
Falling
remember?
About 5%.
About 5%.
He has already
You
said
remember that when we began planning, the share of agriculture was 55-56% in India's GDP.
Yeah, 51%.
And the growth rate that agriculture is able to show, adjusted for cyclical movements, if you take the trend growth rate over long period of time, it has ranged only in the range of 2.5 to 3.5%.
Right.
Whereas industry and services grow on average 7 to 8%. Sometimes services even more than industry. So if you have three sectors and these differential growth rates are there, you allow a certain set of years and you will find that sector which is growing at a relatively lower rate will keep getting a lower and lower share in GDP. My prediction is that if present rates continue, then it will fall to 5%. Your question is then what will happen to the share of labor force in agriculture?
Right.
That will also shift, that will also shrink, but it may not shrink to this level. So 5% may still accommodate 25% or 30%. But I think as a policy measure, and this is the story of growth and development across the development literature that we have been taught, that the process of growth and development lies in the shifting of the center of gravity of the economy from agricultural sector to non-agricultural sectors. I am not talking about villages vis-a-vis cities or urban areas. I am talking only about sectors. You can have industry in your villages or nearby areas. You can have non-agricultural services. But in agriculture, you will not be able to accommodate, or you will not be needing even more than 5% of GDP, because the rate of growth of population is falling, and therefore the rate of growth of food demand is also falling. So you won't need that much of output either. But this would be enough for our food and non-food supply. So I would say, as a policy intervention, we have to really direct labor from out of agriculture into non-agriculture. This is not synonymous of saying that from villages to cities.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that.
That will call Yeah,
Okay.
that will call for upskilling the skills of unskilled worker.
Yes, very much, very much. A change in the mindset and a lot of skilling. Yes.
Now, any Charan, any other question? I see Dr. Matthew Kurian. Yeah,
Yes.
please.
I have 3 pointed questions. The first is your reference to demographic dividend. Now there is a new trend in our country. Youth after +2 prefer to migrate to other countries, initially for studying, but subsequently they may settle down there. This is a new phenomenon. How do you react to that? The second one is, now we distinguish between old and new economies. So new economies are making the global economic scenario very uncertain. If that is the case, how you are going to predict this sort of 100-year type of Indian economy? The third point, I think that distribution is very problematic in our country. Won't it affect the growth trend? Thank you very much for
Yes.
excellent.
Yeah. Now you
I
will.
think we can give a chance to Professor for one of pointed questions before
Yes.
Professor Srivastava takes over.
Yes, please.
If the
Sir,
chair
it was
permits.
amazing
Yeah.
to listen to the fact that we'll be reaching even 2% growth rate in 2020. And we share 25% of the world growth in 1700. It was, of course, a very Hindu presentation that way. But then similar projections were made by SDSN Networks, Sachs of Columbia University, when 24/7 round the world seminar was held, workshops were held during COVID. Era of growth rates, very high growth rates, which we have experienced, and our craze for growth rate more than 10% should vanish at this rate. But then there is nothing wrong in growing slowly and focusing on economic distribution and redistribution rather than on growth rate only. How do you feel about it?
Yes. I think very useful observations.
Yes,
so
please.
I will address first Professor Matthew's questions, and then I'll come to it. Your first point was about migration of human resources from out of India to countries abroad. And this, in my view, had started in the 60s and gathered momentum as time went by. My own view is that initial thrust towards migration came because of the reservation policy that India followed. And many talented students felt themselves competed out from both educational opportunities and from jobs remaining within India, and they found it easier to migrate to other countries, and therefore they went abroad. And our initial reaction was that this brain drain has been contributing negatively to our growth rates. But now there is a time to reassess this situation, in the sense that these people who went abroad and settled there became assets for the Indian economy, not only in terms of the remittances that they made, they remain wedded to the motherland. And they have made massive transfer of resources, and some of the new generation migrants, having settled there for 5, 10 years, 15 years, are coming back to India, but not seeking a job. They are setting up all of these startups and doing very well. So I think that there is now, in this new global situation, there is a cyclical movement of people. Now they go abroad, they settle there, they earn, come back, and they create jobs within the country and so on. So I think that contribution is something that we need not mind anymore. And further, as we go into the future, more and more people from more and more human resources from out of India, if trained, skilled, technically advanced, will also contribute to our service sector exports, which can be provided there while they remain in India because of all these IT enabled facilities, or they go abroad and provide hospital services, teaching services, and so on and so forth. So now, in a globalized economy, we should not mind. And I don't think we will be able to absorb that much of population. They need to go and serve the world, which will be good for us because they will only become more and more assets for us. So that was your first question. What was the second question, please?
One more thing is that our
Old and new
youth population
economy,
is
making new economy very uncertain for the future.
Yes, yeah. So new economy is something that creates a discontinuity in a traditional economy like ours. But we have found that in terms of the
this makes us
in terms of the rate at which the Indian people adjusted to the digital revolution very quickly, and the extent to which digital transactions have taken off, IT has taken off. Even even an auto person would accept a payment through a digital mode, and they are very savvy in terms of participating in the new economy. So I think that we have to really facilitate adoption of the new economy in India because that is our future also. We can't remain the traditional economy. And luckily, the rate at which we are able, our general population is able to adopt is quite fast. Now, one question was common in the sense that you asked about, what about distribution and inequality of incomes? This question is a very pertinent one. And if this is not attended to, then the demographic dividend will become a nightmare for us. The reason is that unemployment and very steep differences in the distribution of income can lead to massive amount of social unrest. Part of the strategy that we have to really think of is to productively employ both labor, both male and female labor within the economy and in our service sector exports. So we have, if the biggest challenge that policymakers face today is to be identified, I would say that is the challenge. How to increase the employment rate, which for example in the female participation rate, it had come down to even less than 20 at some point of time. Now it is slightly better at about 24, 25 and so on. But there's so much scope of employing these people, giving them income so that they can participate in the overall dynamics of the economy. So I would say that is a challenge the policymakers really need to think about that one.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Sir,
Yes, Charan, any other questions?
I think we should close now, but there are two more questions which Professor Srivastava are in the chat box, and I thought they were worth your attention. One is on the floating exchange rate, and you in your presentation did consider the exchange rate, so I thought if you have any observations to make on that. And then
what is the question?
The question is by Subrit Kumar Nishanka. We are using the floating exchange rate. What will happen?
So, he has assumed, on behalf of Professor Srivastava, he has assumed 2.5% rate of depreciation per annum. That is the kind of
correct.
Okay.
So
what is the next question? Yeah.
Okay, yes, let us proceed.
See, the other question that I thought was good, how we can make our migrant workers of the unorganized sector self-reliable. Because Dr. Srivastava spoke about the pension part, I thought this is also a good question if you have any comments on it.
Okay.
Well, we have to really weave a network in which big industries remain linked to MSMEs for their input supplies and so on. In many cities, you will find, for example, in Tamil Nadu, in Karnataka, and so on, there is a lot of interlinkage between one big industry around which a lot of satellite industries are there. And a lot of unorganized labor can be absorbed in the first stage in the MSME sectors, which are becoming a slightly more formalized and slightly more organized. But we have to push them into this. That would be one route. The other route is, of course, the one that is take advantage of some of the initiatives like Mudra and so on, set up your self-help groups, and then develop a productive contribution to the economy, start earning, and then slowly develop your skills and enterprise, and then move to the formal and organized economy.
Can I just, Mr. Chairman, there is another question, and I thought a good question from Devolina. If we bifurcate the population into two parts, there are two savings rates. Was that considered? Further, was the dual nature of Indian economy was it considered?
Well, the dual nature of the Indian economy was being considered in the 50s and 60s far more prominently than now. And as the share, as I say, some of the answer is in fact some of the questions that you had asked, namely that as the share of agriculture keeps coming down, the dominant role that the dual economy played when that share was as high as 50% or more is not present anymore. The economy is now more of industry and services and much less of the subsistence sector. The term that was used in those days was the subsistence economy vis-a-vis the rest of the economy. That subsistence economy has become much less, and the rest of the economy has become much larger. And I don't think we have even data for this distinction between the dual saving rates and so on. So we have not, I concede that we did not consider it, but I also say that we did not consider it relevant.
Shall I now make my closing kind of a comments? But it is also a question, and I would welcome some short response from you because I have also worked quite a lot on this. One thing that I have found is that all these IMF, OECD, Asian Development Bank, all these frameworks which talk about the growth, they are talking largely in terms of the neoclassical framework, the neoclassical growth accounting framework. Within the application realm of the developed country, by and large. In fact, for the non-developed or developing countries, you hardly have very substantial and rigorous studies on the growth accounting part. As a result, what you find is that most of these organizations follow the classic framework of considering only two factors of production, namely labor and capital. They typically ignore the land because the structural changes in the developed countries are no longer taking place. In fact, the structural changes are practically, the economies are practically mature in that sense that there are no further changes. Like say, for instance, the urbanization is at that peak. The kind of sectoral shifts are at the peak. I mean, nothing is happening on this front. In India, on the other hand, as you have very rightly pointed out in your report, and you have mentioned something in the passing, however, you have not dwelled on that. Namely, that urbanization is a very significant factor you have worked on the 12th Finance Commission and 15th Finance Commission, and you have referred to those things. I fully agree and appreciate that part. But what is relevant is that our urbanization extent is significantly understated. Even in
Yes.
terms of official implementation of the definitions, it is understated. We are not likely to clock something like 50% urbanization. We are likely to clock 60 to 65% urbanization if we go strictly by the definition that we are following. Unfortunate part is that for various other reasons, we are not following the definition so far. Otherwise, right now itself, in 2011 itself, our rate of urbanization would have been something like 40 to 43%. I mean, you are aware about this. I don't have
Yes.
to tell you.
Yes.
Now the point is that every time we revise the base rate, base for the National Account Statistics, we do estimate urban-rural breakup of the GDP. And if we go by that framework, it is the definition which is followed by the census. Now, under these kind of things, sir, it's a simple kind of an arithmetic. It's a simple arithmetic that the urban productivity of the labor and the rural productivity of the labor in the same sector is significantly more. That is, the differentials are substantial. That means that whenever the rural population shifts to urban population and rural workforce shifts to urban workforce, there is going to be a significant gain in terms of the productivity. That is number one. Number two, the same way, the sectoral shift will take place, and that is also a very productive enhancing shift. Third thing is unorganized to organized activities. That also is a shift, which is a productivity enhancing shift. Similarly, you find privatized thing, that is, public sector employment to private sector employment, there is a shift. And there is going to be a significant shift. Unfortunate part is that the Ricardian theory, which is being used by all these things to measure the quality of labor and get the multipliers, do not get into this thing, because our public sector salaries are not in tandem with the marginal productivity. Now, if you go by these things, if you measure the labor productivity, and that is, labor quality, the quality index is not properly measured. The OECD and IMF and everybody is silent on this. Similarly, you are talking about urbanization. They are silent on this. If you are looking at the land as a resource, sir, land as a resource in India is a substantial contributor. We are reclaiming the land also, and we are doing this kind of thing. As a result, we find that you are in a position to significantly increase the rate of growth of the technological progress, which is called residual in that framework. Sir, you have been extremely conservative, I would say, in your things.
True.
You're extremely conservative. If you adjust for all these things, maybe your growth rates would marginally go still up. It will not be just the 6.5 and 2% kind of a thing range. It might turn out to be 7.5% and about 3% range. I think if you look at that thing, then the dates that you are giving maybe, advance quite a bit, in the sense that by 2047 or 48, something which you are assuming at around 2053, 54 or 56 might occur around that thing, 7-8 years ahead. I think this is a point. It's a methodological point. It's a criticism of the theory, and it is also the modification in your estimates. That is all that I would rather like. But otherwise, it was an excellent study. very well getting into the same thing. You have the established kind of reputation, and it goes according to your reputation. You have gone into the details. I was very happy. But for these observations, sir, it is excellent. Thank you very much.
I will briefly respond.
Yes, please.
First, by saying that you are quite right and pertinent on all the points that you have raised. We have looked at the methodology, and we have, as I indicated in the beginning, this is an ongoing work. We have experimented with we have experimented with concepts in which we do not utilize either capital or labor directly. As an alternative to the present one, we have used a concept called augmented capital supply and augmented labor. So labor is augmented by an index of skill, and capital is augmented by an index of available energy and power supply and some other factors. So indirectly, we are bringing in some of the considerations that you have pointed out. On urbanization also, we have said, even the Finance Commission had observed that in India, urbanization is understated, and there are some studies recently which look at the night light through the satellites, and then they identify what areas are where we can be classified as those urban activities. That area is much larger than what the census figures bring out, and so on. So when the extent of use of power increases, we can indirectly capture that, and so on. So we have experimented with some of those models also, and I have to say that some of those growth rates are higher. Although if I go all the way along that, then there would be the criticism of the other side, from the other side, saying that how are you going to accelerate and say that within 20 years you are going to overtake this economy, that economy, and so on. That's another dimension of the question. So we are every year we hope that we will bring out with a revised version, particularly because base years are changing so fast and the global economy is so unstable. And so let us see. But thank you very much for your observations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, shall we close the session?
Yeah.
A big thank you and applause to Dr. Srivastava. Great.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I must thank Professor Dholakia to have agreed to chair this session, and to Dr. Srivastava to have accepted the invite to offer and share his report with us. I was very impressed, and I'm really thankful to you for sharing in detail your report. And I'm also thankful to all the participants who have joined and the participants who have asked questions to enrich the discussion. It's a challenge. I wanted India to grow faster so that I have a chance to be, but by 248, I would have probably been too old cash that status. But you are refusing to make it at 10%. So I will continue to live in hope that we'll have it to 10%, and I'll see a rich India before I pass away.
Okay.
Thank you
That's
very
the
much, Professor Charan.
observation.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
I have an important announcement to make, and that is this presentation and discussion today will be available on EGROW's website by noon tomorrow. Dr. Srivastava's presentation is based on a beautiful report, and this report was presented at the World Economic Forum a few weeks ago. We will link the report in our discussion, which will be on the website for all to see.
Thank you.
I'm sure many will benefit from it, and I think many will use it for public policy and classroom academic teaching too.
Thank you.
Next week on Friday, 24th, we are going to have another interesting discussion on multi-dimensional poverty in our country. And this discussion by Professor Amitabh Kundu. Amitabh Kundu, an expert on many things, and of course on urbanization. And while Professor Dholakia was making that point and about land, I was thinking about him. But next week, his theme is going to be multidimensional poverty, measuring it and how to assess it. So I would invite all of you to kindly join. The last announcement I want to make is a very thrilling announcement. It's very, very exciting. 10 weeks starting from March 3, we are dedicating to G20 Task Force 5. We are going to discuss all types of issues in those 10 weeks. We are going to discuss about the international financial architecture, to discuss about climate, about debt sustainability, name it, all the issues that Task Force 5 of G20 has, we are going to discuss. And who are the people who are going to join us? We'll have a blend of domestic experts and international experts from across the world joining us. So I would welcome you to kindly make a provision in your diaries, pencil it. 10 Fridays starting from March 3 will be dedicated to Task Force 5 under G20. We have the presidency and EGROW is participating in that initiative wholeheartedly. With this, once again, let me thank Professor Dholakia, Professor Srivastava for today's excellent mind-blowing informative discussion on predicting India's growth and reassuring us that we will again gather that glory in a few decades from now that we had lost to people who came to us as a tea company and totally stole the show. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.